No one ever expected Elias to be dangerous. His face had the softness of solitude, his eyes the quiet sorrow of a man too long untouched by love. In the cafes of Florence, he was invisible, his presence folding into the wallpaper of men sipping espresso and pretending to read. But Elias had a secret, or rather he had found one. It came to him not through a miracle, but through madness or something close to it. A long and feverish winter confined him to his attic apartment, his body crumbling under illness, his mind craving escape. In his delirium, he reached for a book that had long gathered dust on his shelf, The Prince by Niccolo Machiavelli. What began as a desperate distraction became obsession. Elias devoured every line as if each paragraph were holy scripture cloaked in cynicism. But what struck him most was not Machiavelli's advice to rulers. It was what could be extrapolated, reinterpreted, transformed. If a prince must learn to manipulate men to retain power, could a man learn to manipulate love? Elias began to write a second book hidden within the first. He called it The Art of Seductive Power. It was not about charm, nor flattery, nor empty aphrodisiacs whispered in candlelight. No, it was about understanding. Not of love, but of need. Every woman, Elias wrote, carries within her a hidden court of advisors, memories of betrayal, dreams of significance, fears of being overlooked. He who learns to sit quietly in that court, listening without being noticed, will one day issue the decree. And so, Elias became a student of women not as people to love, but as systems to read. He observed their gestures, the tremor in their voices when recalling their childhoods, the way they looked away when saying they were fine. He never once lied. Machiavelli had warned of deception that could not be sustained. Instead, Elias learned the art of implication, suggesting without asking, withdrawing affection not as punishment, but as invitation. He never seduced with lust. He seduced with presence. Women began to fall for him not because he pursued them, but because he seemed to see them in ways no one else dared. Cernay was the first, a violinist, her fingers trembling from unspoken anxiety. She met Elias in a bookstore. He said nothing of her beauty. Instead, he asked her if music ever felt like a cage. She cried the first night they kissed. Then came Lucia, an ambitious architect who had never once let a man see her cry. Elias told her he loved the spaces she designed more than her smile. She kissed him before she knew why. By spring, Elias had become a legend in whispers. Not among men, they still ignored him, but among women. He listens, they said. He sees, they added. He knows, they whispered, afraid of what he might know next. But with power comes erosion. Machiavelli had spoken of it how even the wisest prince, if he begins to believe he is invincible, becomes vulnerable. Elias began to test limits. How far could a woman be drawn into her own reflection? How deep could he plant suggestions before they no longer recognized themselves? It was with Sophia that the mirror cracked. A poetess with laughter that struck like bells and silences that cut like blades. She knew Machiavelli too. She had read The Prince at 16 and annotated it with rage. Elias tried his usual strategies, listening, withholding, offering only fragments of intimacy. But Sophia did not lean in. She leaned away. She studied him. You mistake understanding for love, she told him once in manipulation for intimacy. He smiled, as if her resistance proved his point. But it was the first time his confidence trembled. Sophia began to reverse the game. She would disappear for days, then return with poems that felt like diagnoses. She praised him publicly and mocked him privately. She planted in him the seed of uncertainty, until Elias for the first time felt the ache of longing. Real longing, not for power, but for connection. Machiavelli had warned, it is better to be feared than loved, if you cannot be both. But he had never warned of what happened when a man was no longer feared or loved. Elias became hollow, not from heartbreak, but from revelation. The formula worked, yes. He could get what he wanted. But he no longer knew what he wanted. He had mastered the game only to realize he had never known the prize. He stood once more in his attic apartment. The prince opened before him, its pages now weary with ink. He touched the spine of his own manuscript, The Art of Seductive Power, but could not bring himself to open it. It's not because it was wrong, but because it was incomplete. There is a difference, he now understood, between getting what you want and becoming who you are. And the question lingered like a riddle at the end of all seduction. Who wins when both hearts lose? Elias disappeared from Florence for some time. No one saw him in the cafes. The bookstore where he met Katerina said he had stopped coming. His apartment remained untouched, books stacked like miniature fortresses, old notebooks filled with diagrams of emotional tension, power dynamics, and annotated quotes from Machiavelli and Nietzsche alike. But he was gone. He traveled east, away from cities that knew his name in whispers. Through the Balkans into the silent monasteries of Romania, he sought something older than seduction, older than Machiavellian craft. Perhaps, he thought, in silence, he could learn what no book had taught him, how to be without conquering. In the quiet stone of a Carpathian monastery, Elias met Father Lucian, a man who had renounced words entirely. He lived without speech, communicating only through gestures, the occasional scrawled note, and a gaze as sharp as truth. The monks took Elias in without question. He helped gather wood, cook meals, clean floors. His hands, once instruments of elegance, grew rough. Silence deepened, but Elias did not abandon his mind. At night he wrote, not in books of power, but in journals of doubt. He questioned the very roots of his former philosophy. If the soul becomes a fortress, and love merely a strategy to breach it, have I ever truly lived? He dreamed of Sophia often, not her face, but her voice, the way it accused without anger, the way it called him back to himself. Her absence was not a wound, but a mirror. And in that mirror, he saw himself as he had never dared before, not as a prince, not as a tactician, but as a boy who once craved to be seen and had, instead, chosen to be feared. 2 years passed, when Elias returned to Florence. It was as if the city had shifted in his absence. The women he once enchanted had moved on. Katerina had married, Lucia had moved to Lisbon. Sophia had vanished entirely, but Elias was no longer the same. He went to a printer and published his original manuscript, but under a different title. The Mirror and the Mask, a Philosophy of Intimacy. He wrote an introduction that shattered the core of his previous ideas. This is not a book about women. It is a confession, a map of my own cowardice, disguised as mastery. I offer it not as a manual, but as a mirror so that others may see themselves before they choose to see through others. To his surprise, the book spread like wildfire, first among women, then among men. Not because it taught how to seduce, but because it revealed the emptiness of manipulation. In his vulnerability, Elias had finally touched something true. One evening, while reading in a corner of a quiet museum, Elias felt a presence. Not dramatic, not invasive, just familiar. He looked up Sophia. Her hair was shorter. More light. I read it, she said, holding up the book. And you stopped trying to win, he nodded. I lost too much to keep playing. They sat together in silence for a long time, not as adversaries or enigmas, but as echoes of the same journey. Outside, the sun dipped below the horizon, and Florence exhaled with the weight of centuries. And for the first time, Elias didn't wonder what she wanted from him more, what he could draw from her. He simply asked softly, like a man learning to speak anew, "Will you walk with me?" And she did. Florence shimmered that night, not with the electric dazzle of modern cities, but with a subtler, older light, the kind that lives in stone, in the echoes of footsteps down narrow alleys. In the silence between two people who once stood on opposite ends of desire, Elias and Sophia walked without destination. He did not attempt to explain himself. She did not try to define what they were. They passed the Arno, its water whispering secrets older than Machiavelli himself. For a time, they simply moved through the city like two thoughts in the same mind. "Tell me," Sophia said, finally breaking the quiet, "when did you begin to feel again?" Elias paused, considering. When I stopped trying to write people into roles. When I realized I was not the author of others. Sophia smiled, but it was the kind of smile that carries questions. And yet, you still write, he admitted. But now, I write to understand, not to control. They stopped at a small piazza where street performers played violins under flickering gas lamps. An old woman sold roasted chestnuts from a cart. A boy laughed as he chased pigeons. Elias looked at Sophia and realized something terrifying. He didn't know what would happen next. It thrilled him. They sat on a bench and listened to the violins. Sophia turned to him with eyes no longer guarded. You know, she said, I never hated you, I feared, becoming what you wanted me to be. And now, I wonder, she said softly, what we could be if we wanted nothing from each other. The words didn't hurt. They healed. For the first time in years, Elias felt something uncalculated stirring in him, something raw and beautiful. Hope. That night, Sophia did not come home with him. They parted with no promises, no veiled seductions, only the warmth of possibility. Days turned into weeks. They began to see each other again, not in the shadows of analysis, but in the light of shared experience. They debated art, walked through museums, read poetry aloud. Sophia would sometimes disappear for a day or two, and Elias would not panic. He had learned to trust space. He had learned that love, when real, did not need surveillance. It needed room to breathe. One afternoon, sitting by a garden fountain, Sophia pulled a small notebook from her bag. Do you remember the poem I wrote? About you? She asked. You mean the one where I was a shadow wearing a crown? She laughed. Yes, that one. I think I want to revise it. He looked at her. Into what? Maybe. What? Into a man learning to walk barefoot. That evening, Elias began a new book. Not a philosophical treatise, not a guide, just a story. A novel. Titled it The Silence Between. The first line read, he once believed every heart was a castle to be stormed in, till he found one that invited him to knock. In time, the book would touch people far beyond Florence. Not because it revealed a secret formula, but because it dismantled the illusion that one was ever needed. Elias and Sophia never married. They never claimed permanence. But for years they chose each other daily without strategy, without masks. And in the quiet, in the unremarkable hours between their shared mornings and solitary evenings, Elias discovered the only real formula worth pursuing. It's not how to get what you want from someone, but how to remain when nothing is asked. Autumn arrived, gently, brushing Florence with golden light and the scent of dying leaves. The rhythm of Elias and Sophia's companionship deepened, not through spectacle, but through the ordinary. It was in how they made coffee, how they folded laundry, how they argued over whether silence meant contentment or withdrawal. They never used the word relationship. It felt too narrow. What they shared was something subtler, more spacious, a dance between freedom and devotion. One evening, as the wind threaded through open windows, Elias found himself revisiting his past, not out of nostalgia, but necessity. He returned to his old notebooks, the ones filled with diagrams of psychological manipulation, emotional leverage, and tactics derived from the prince. He did not look upon them with shame. He looked upon them as a surgeon might regard the instruments of a previous sharp, but primitive. He took a red pen and began to annotate them, not with corrections, but with questions. Next to the sentence, withhold affection to intensify desire, he wrote. But what is desire without peace? Next to, mirror her ideal self until she believes you are part of it. He wrote, does she need a mirror or someone who sees beyond reflection? He considered compiling these notes into a new edition, a companion work that dismantled the original from within. Not as repentance, but as revelation. The world, after all, was still thirsty for power. But perhaps, he thought, some might be ready for truth. Sophia, meanwhile, had been quiet, not distant, but inward. She spent her nights revising her poetry collection, weaving Elias into her verses, not as a subject, but as a lens. She was no longer trying to escape his influence. She was transforming it. One morning, over espresso and the scent of rain, Sophia said, do you think love is ever truly free of power? Elias looked at her, thinking deeply. No, but I think we can choose what kind of power we allow it to be. Not domination, not control, but the power to witness, to name, to hold space without claiming ownership. She nodded slowly. Then perhaps that's the only formula we should have ever been searching for. They decided, without ceremony, to travel together, not as a couple. Not as fugitives of their past, but as collaborators in becoming. Their first stop was Lisbon, where Lucia, Elias, former companion, now hosted lectures on architecture and gender. Sophia suggested they attend one of her public readings. "Are you afraid?" Sophia asked, before they boarded the train. "I was," Elias admitted. "But now, I think I'm curious." In Lisbon, they sat in the back of the hall. Lucia was radiant, composed, articulate, completely unfazed. During the Q&A, Elias raised his hand. When she saw him, her expression changed, not with bitterness, but recognition. "I just wanted to say," he said, "thank you for teaching me what you never meant to." Lucia smiled and replied, "And thank you for becoming more than what you once were." After the event, they shared wine. No apologies were exchanged, only stories. It was enough. Elias and Sophia continued their journey through Istanbul, Alexandria, and eventually Kyoto. In each place, Elias gave small talks, not on seduction, but on unlearning. His audience was always a mix: skeptics, seekers, cynics. He never gave them answers, only questions. One young man, clearly clinging to the old ways, asked during a session, "But isn't it better to control the dynamic than to risk rejection?" Elias smiled, not cruelly, but gently. "Rejection is the tuition we pay to be real." And with that, silence fell over the room. Elias knew the journey would never be complete. Neither would the story. Perhaps that was the point. Winter met them in Kyoto with an elegance only Japan could muster, snow falling like quiet philosophies. The temples draped in a hush that seemed older than memory. Elias found himself drawn to the Zen gardens, where raked lines curved around still stones, and the silence was a kind of presence. Sophia walked ahead, her scarf fluttering like a question he had yet to answer. One morning, while visiting Ryanji, Elias sat before the dry landscape, watching the 13 visible stones and wondering why. From any perspective, one was always hidden. The metaphor struck him immediately. We never see the whole truth of another, not through love, not through power, not even through silence. Sophia approached, sitting beside him without speaking. For a long time, they simply watched the garden, as if it were a language neither could fully translate. "I've been thinking," she said at last, "about whether our story belongs only to us." Elias turned to her. "What do you mean?" "I mean, your talks, your book, my poems. All of it came from what we lived. But do we owe the world that vulnerability, or do we keep something sacred, untouched?" Elias considered this deeply. The old Elias, the one driven by Machiavellian calculus, would have seized the moment, made it a metaphor, turned her hesitation into leverage. But now, all he wanted was to understand the space between her words. "Maybe," he said slowly, "the sacred isn't what we keep hidden. It's what we're willing to offer without needing to be understood." As someone convinced, but as someone seen, they spent that winter writing together. Not about each other, but around each other. Parallel meditations on intimacy, identity, and the spaces between language. Their writings were compiled into a single volume, forms of quiet letters from the unnamed. It was unlike anything either had written before, free of pretense. Rich in pause, the world received it as a philosophical love story, though neither of them used that phrase. To Elias and Sophia, it was simply a shared act of remembering who they had become in each other's presence. One night, during a literary panel in Tokyo, an elderly Japanese poet asked Elias, "Do you believe your old writings were evil?" Elias responded, "No, they were frightened." The room went still. Sophia looked at him with something softer than admiration, something like forgiveness. In the months that followed, they returned to Florence briefly, only to find the city less intimate now. Their old apartment, the cafes, the benches, they had become relics, echoes of people they no longer were. So they moved again, this time to a quiet village in southern France, a house with stone walls, a garden overgrown with lavender, and a single room dedicated to writing they no longer needed. To travel. The journey, it seemed, had settled inside them. One afternoon, sitting under the shade of a fig tree, Sophia turned to Elias. "Do you think," she asked, "we ever stopped being who we were back then?" Elias thought about it, about power and presence, about hunger and peace. About the boy who read Machiavelli in a fevered winter and thought he'd found a weapon. "I think," he said, "we became the question that undid us." And she replied, "Then maybe that's the most honest kind of love." They sat in silence after that, not because there was nothing left to say, but because nothing more needed to be said. The wind moved through the lavender like a hand turning. Pages spring in the village unfolded with a gentleness that felt almost rehearsed, like the earth itself had read the manuscripts Elias and Sophia were writing and decided to echo them in bloom. Lavender spilled into their windows. The sound of bees, church bells, and distant laughter formed the rhythm of their days. And yet even within this calm, the question of legacy began to stir. Sophia was the first to bring it up. "Do you think we've disappeared?" she asked one morning, as they sat beneath an almond tree whose petals floated down like confessions. Elias looked up from his notebook. "Disappeared from where? From the world that once needed our voices? Or maybe the world we once needed?" He considered. Their work had rippled outward, translated, debated, even misquoted. Forms of Quiet had become a kind of underground guidebook for those tired of transactional intimacy. Elias' old writings were now studied alongside his new ones in universities that sought to explore the arc of his transformation from manipulator to mystic. But here, in the village, time moved slowly, and they were no longer characters in anyone's theory. "I don't know if we've disappeared," Elias finally answered, "but I know we've become less ... central. And maybe that's what healing looks like." Sophia nodded, but her eyes carried something else. A distance. Not from him, but from permanence. That evening, Elias found her writing a letter. "To whom?" he asked. "Myself. 5 years ago. Do you want to share it?" She hesitated, then passed it to him. The letter read, "You thought survival meant control? You thought presence meant performance. But you were wrong, and thank God for that. You will meet a man who mirrors both your wounds and your wisdom. He will both teach and unteach you. Do not try to hold him. Try only to hold yourself steady as you walk beside him. When the time comes, let the silence speak more than the story ever could." Elias looked up. "Are you leaving?" Sophia didn't flinch. "Not yet, but I might. And not because I don't love you, but because love for me is motion. And sometimes stillness begins to feel like surrender." He nodded slowly. The pain wasn't sharp. It was round, like a stone worn by the sea. Familiar, ancient. "I would rather you leave as you are," he said, "than stay and become someone else to keep me comfortable." They did not make love that night. They held hands and listened to the wind. Over the next weeks, they continued writing, laughing, even dreaming. But there was a lightness to Sophia's presence now, as if she were already half wind, half memory. One morning, Elias woke to find her side of the bed empty. On the table, her manuscript, a note. "This is not goodbye. This is continuation in another form, right? Teach, become. I will meet you again, perhaps in pages, perhaps in people. But I will know you by your questions." Elias wept not, out of loss, but recognition. She had revealed him, and so he stayed, in the village, in the house. In the rhythm of his thoughts, he taught philosophy. Florence, where it all began, a bookstore, displayed a copy in its window, beneath a sign that read, "Understanding is the only seduction that outlives beauty." La remained in the village, not out of nostalgia, but out of rhythm. She turned the house into a retreat for writers and thinkers. She published her own works, blending Elias' philosophy with her own voice, more fiery, more immediate, more alive. And sometimes, When the lavender bloomed and the fig tree cast its broad shadow, she would sit beneath it and imagine Elias and Sophia not as figures in the past, but as presences still moving across the page, across the world, across the lives of those who no longer wished to win but simply to witness. In the end, Elias did not conquer, did not seduce the world into remembering him. He simply told the truth of his becoming, and in doing so, became unforgettable.